Or if you think about, like, why does the property existing, if there is such a property, or just the fact that anything exists, why does that itself exist? Why does the fact that anything exists, why does that fact exist? And you say, well, there's some explanation of that fact. Well, again, you have a circularity problem, because any explanation of existence would have to itself already exist. And so what explains its existence? You run into a kind of circularity. And I want to just be very clear that even if you have an infinite regress of causes, the infinite regress of causes, like infinite chain of dominoes, let's say you have an infinite chain of blue dominoes. Each domino is knocked down by a prior domino. And so why did that domino get knocked down? Well, you could say it's because of a prior domino. But you still haven't explained the whole chain of dominoes. Why are there blue dominoes? Why are there any dominoes at all? Why not just nothing? Why not no dominoes or something else? In order to explain that, it seems like you're going to run into this kind of circularity problem. And so the next step on my sort of bridge of reason is just to recognize the puzzle. There's a puzzle here. There's a question here. It leads to a puzzle. And so we need to see how we might be able to solve that. And that will lead to the third step, which is my solution.
How can reason lead to God? And is it possible to rationally arrive at the knowledge of God's existence? My name is Mikhail Bakumov. It's Project Reason Plus Faith, and today we're in for terrific conversation with one of the leading philosophers of our time, and we have Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, who is specialized in metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion, with particular focus on foundational questions about existence and consciousness. He is an author of several great books, including Who Are You Really? How Reason Can Lead to God, and defended the correspondence theory of truth and also necessary existence with another great philosopher, Alexander Proust. And Dr. Rasmussen has held PhD in philosophy from University of Notre Dame. Okay, Dr. Rasmussen, thank you so much for your time and glad to see you.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this. I'm very excited about our conversation. I think we're going to really show how reason can illuminate steps to a very interesting, I like to call it a treasure of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been so many obstacles in the way of recording this podcast, so surely God has something to say to our listeners today.
That's right. We overcame the obstacles, so there must be something good about this.
Okay. And by the way, I don't know if anyone says something before to you, but you're also one of the most beautiful philosophers, because usually philosophers are very weird guys, but you look so great.
Well, that's really funny. I had to be not too ugly for my wife to like me, because she's like the most beautiful person on the earth. So I've told her that. Anyway, that's just whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with some basic questions. Tell us a little about yourself. How did you become a Christian, and why did you decide to study philosophy?
So yes, thank you. So when I was a child, my family and my community had a worldview that I inherited from them. So that was the Christian worldview. This was based on my upbringing, and it wasn't until I was a senior in high school that I was really thinking about, wait, how can I know that this particular worldview, especially the one that just kind of surrounds me, is the right one if there are other worldviews that other people are raised in that are very different from my own? Is there an independent way? And especially because I realized I couldn't just privilege like my parents. Well, I just trust my parents over other parents. It seemed like I needed some way of investigating. And this led me on a search. And the search led me to discover what I would say is like a larger vision of reality, a reality that includes more than I was sort of thinking of. God is not sort of confined by the box of the particular tradition, or of any particular tradition. I think God is greater than any particular tradition. But then God does show up in traditions. We can find God within various cultural contexts, but just God is not limited to them. So this led to the search, and we'll talk about the step-by-step bridge or pathway that help restore my own belief in the existence of God. And then also, I mean, I don't know if we would talk about this at all, but something that I've done recently is co-authored a paper with Robin Collins, a Christian philosopher, where we talk about the value of a great narrative or a story that we expect to emerge from a being like God. If God exists, we expect there to be a story of adventure, of love, of atonement or one-ment, a restoration, a dynamic story that unfolds over time, and that it has a centerpiece in the life of Christ. So that would be to kind of fill in more than I do in my most of my published work. But there's a publication forthcoming where Robin and I developed this kind of argument.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. I'm currently writing my MA thesis on C.S. Lewis, and I try
Mhm.
to understand Lewis, and he very loves this idea of storytelling and how story can show you reality. So I think it will be great piece of information to my thesis too.
Yeah,
So
so true. Yeah, we cite C.S. Lewis, because you're right. You're absolutely right. He plays with the story elements of reality to help us to see deeper truths that show up in stories.
yeah, absolutely. And let's start maybe with these questions before we going to explore uh, how reason can lead to God. Many people think that it is hard to trust our intellectual abilities to grasp some deep truth about reality. So, do you think it is rationally possible to doubt the reliability of our minds and that our minds can grasp the nature of reality?
This is a very important question because it gets to the question of whether or not we can even succeed in principle in uncovering truths about big questions. Does God exist? What is the nature of reality? And part of the worry here that I see a lot is that philosophers can sort of spin webs of reason to rationalize maybe beliefs that they want to be true. And that these rational webs are untethered to actual reality. Like reason doesn't have the power to reveal actual reality. However, so that's an important worry. And I think part of a solution to this is just intellectual humility, being willing to be wrong, staying curious, looking at the other side of things, at many different sides of things, testing your beliefs, also trying to make more and more observations about reality. So you're working with the tool of reason and the tool of empirical observation and working with all the tools that you have. Um, Next, and this is, I think, maybe what you could be anticipating by the way you put the question, if you take skepticism too far, okay, if you say, I can't really know anything using reason about reality, then you end up cutting off the very tree branch that allows you to even think about skepticism in the first place, right? So, just to draw this out, let's say that you use reason and rational thought to come to the conclusion that you can't know anything about reality. Well, then how could you come to know that you can't? How could you come to know that reality is such that you can't know anything about it? How do you know that reality is unintelligible unless you're using reason? And so it's kind of self-defeating, I think, to take it to the extreme. And there's all sorts of examples, I think, where reason does reveal things about reality. For example, it reveals that there can't be contradictions like something that's both green and not green. Um, and that these contradictions can't exist anywhere in any part of reality. So you can actually infer that reality in total and in every region of reality has no contradictions. And I actually used this principle of no contradictions to make progress in that bridge called the Bridge of Reason, step by step, where I make some deductions that might be surprising. Like you don't know that you could actually see this much with the light of reason until you just use the light and just see what you can see. So I do think that while it's important to be humble and to recognize the limitations of one's thinking and to realize that one does is prone to mistakes, so we sort of need other people to help keep us in balance, and to test our beliefs. I think it's going too far to say at the outset that you can't know anything, to be confident, like, I know that I can't know anything about reality. Um, that itself is a kind of bit of knowledge about reality if it were true. So I think it would be self-defeating. And I do think reason does reveal some things.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think that this approach of classical philosopher René Descartes to go from necessary truths to contingent truths is it good or successful path, or do you think that it could be also rationally denied by some?
Well, tell me more what you're thinking there, this path from necessary truths to contingent truths.
Yeah, I think just in general that he began with some necessary truths like truths of logics and mathematics, and after this he established some truths. And
Hmm.
after he established some truths, he tried to show that God exists, and that's why we can trust our reasonable abilities in all other areas of life, something like this.
I see, yes, even to trust our own faculties of investigation. If you can show that God exists, it gives you sort of independent reason to think God's not going to be misleading you. So now you can trust your faculties that give you contingent truths. Yeah, that is a very interesting project. The path that I take doesn't preclude that particular path, but it doesn't require that path. So the path that I take actually starts with even more basic points of awareness that something exists, for example. Um, so I don't think we have to first deduce that our faculties are reliable in order to see that if nothing at all exists, then that is self-defeating because the very thought that nothing exists doesn't exist. The very um, intention to affirm that nothing exists, doesn't exist. If you say everything's an illusion, the very experience of the illusion doesn't exist. And so I think we have a basic capacity of awareness of both contingent truths and necessary truths, and we can actually be aware of that awareness as we use it. But you don't have to be aware of your awareness to be aware. You don't have to know how you know to know. You can just know. And I think examples show this. You can know if you're thinking of something or if you're feeling something. And you can know, I think, that it would be self-defeating to say that um, it is true that there are no truths. Okay. It is true that nothing exists, not even the truth that nothing exists. I think that is a logical contradiction. So the path that I take it does have some similarities with Descartes' path, but I don't need to first show that God exists to show that my faculties are reliable. Rather, I take another path that uses the faculties in ways that are, let's say, universal and would be self-defeating to not use them, at least in those minimal ways.
Okay, great. So we start with something exists, and
Yes.
after this we try to understand why something exists, yeah? And we go to the next step. And could you describe a little bit more?
So the bridge of reason, you can think of this as a sequence of steps where you can test each step. And in principle, you can come to know that that step is true, the step at that point. So the first step onto the bridge of reason is just the step that something exists. It's the premise that something exists. And, as I said, I think you can know that something exists. Now, let me just say, you don't have to 100% know every single step in order for the steps to provide evidence for you, right? But just for the sake of like fun and challenge, as well as because I think it's valuable if you can know something with certainty, I've raised a high bar for myself, and I want to see if I can actually have a bridge of reason where you can know each step. Um, it's not just that the steps are more probable or something. You can know them. But I just want to say that you don't have to know each step for them to do work in your mind to be evidence. So the first step is just that something exists. And I think that that's evident. It's self-defeating to deny anything exists. So if something exists, then there's the question that you raise, which is what explains why anything exists? The reason why we would ask this question is because it's part of our ordinary experience to explain things. This cup here exists, right? Now, nobody watching this show has seen the origin of this cup. So for all that you've seen with your eyes, this cup might have come into being uncaused without any explanation. It just, like maybe 4 minutes ago, there was nothing here and then it just appeared. And it even made a little sound, which also was uncaused and unexplained. Probably you don't think that that cup was uncaused, even though you don't see with your eyes, because you, with your mind, can extrapolate from your experience that things that exist because of prior conditions or prior causes. At least this is part of our ordinary experience of things that exist. But if you take this all the way out, then you do have a puzzle or kind of a paradox. And I want to just be clear, everybody has this paradox. Whether you believe that God exists or you don't believe that God exists, everybody thinking about this, just using your mind, can realize, wait a second, how could there be anything that exists if everything that exists has to have a deeper explanation? I mean, think about it. Imagine that reality in total has some deeper explanation. Well, the explanation of reality in total would itself have to be real. So it'd be part of reality in total, which is a kind of circular explanation. That's like a chicken making itself exist. That doesn't seem to be a real explanation. It's not a satisfying explanation. Or if you think about like, why does the property existing, if there is such a property, or just the fact that anything exists, why does that itself exist? Why does the fact that anything exists, why does that fact exist? And you say, well, there's some explanation of that fact. Well, again, you have a circularity problem because any explanation of existence would have to itself already exist. And so what explains its existence? You run into a kind of circularity. And I want to just be very clear that even if you have an infinite regress of causes, the infinite regress of causes, like infinite chain of dominoes, let's say you have an infinite chain of blue dominoes. Each domino is knocked down by a prior domino. And so why did that domino get knocked down? Well, you could say it's because of a prior domino. But you still haven't explained the whole chain of dominoes. Why are there blue dominoes? Why are there any dominoes at all? Why not just nothing? Why not no dominoes or something else? In order to explain that, it seems like you're going to run into this kind of circularity problem. And so the next step on my sort of bridge of reason is just to recognize the puzzle. There's a puzzle here. There's a question here. It leads to a puzzle. And so we need to see how we might be able to solve that. And that will lead to the third step, which is my solution. But any questions about the steps so far?
Yeah, sure. And I think the question that I often ask in like my ordinary conversation in my church, for example, people ask, can we see these distinctions between necessary and contingent that you will describe a little bit more? Can we see this distinction in any other area of life except these questions about necessary existence? Because it sounds like we have these distinctions only about these questions and not other questions.
Yeah, so students have asked me this question as well. And two things I want to say about it. So, first, you might be able to point to mathematical truths as a possible example that would be sort of another category that has nothing to do with this argument. It's just, necessary that 1 plus 1 equals 2, and that's a truth. And you might think it's true because it corresponds with reality. So there's an actual necessary abstract reality that 2 plus 2 equals true, 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's true. That corresponds to an abstract reality. So some philosophers think that there's a kind of abstract, necessary realm of mathematical realities. And this is why mathematics can proceed and make discoveries of things that are true independently of our discovery. It's not that we discover them and then they become true. It's that we're discovering something that is already there to be discovered. Now, let me just say, I mean, this is, of course, a controversial view about the nature of mathematics. In fact, all the cases of a necessary reality are going to be controversial, which leads to my second point, which is why we have another argument for the existence of something being necessary. So the argument is like, let's just say that everything is not necessary. By necessary, I mean that its existence cannot be otherwise. It must exist, right? So if it's not necessary, that means that its non-existence is a real possibility. It could fail to exist. So, this cup, it could be destroyed. It could be assembled. There was a time before this cup existed. So its existence, its inclusion within reality is not a matter of necessity. If everything's purely contingent, then I think that actually makes the puzzle of existence really actually puzzling to the point of being severely problematic. Because if everything's purely contingent, then it's kind of like you just have this blue ocean of contingent realities that didn't have to exist. Okay. So you can't say it exists because it has to exist. You can't say that. It actually might not have existed at all. It can fail to exist. And that I think is part of what inspires the question. Well, then why does it exist rather than not? What explains its existence? And I think both reason and science are two witnesses that support the universal principle of cause and effect. It's not that everything that exists, whether it's contingent or necessary, has to depend on some prior cause. It's that every contingent reality depends on some prior cause. And I think we can just think about this using reason together with observations. We have experiences of things coming from other things. And so we want to have a general principle to explain that experience. And here's a general principle. It's a broad principle with, I think, no known counterexamples. And I'm not aware of any other principle that precludes or competes with this principle of cause and effect that is as well supported. And it's the principle that any contingent reality, whether small or large, whether blue or red or any other color, any contingent reality that exists because of some prior cause or condition. And it's from that principle that you can now deduce to avoid circularity that the condition for the total of all contingent realities, the condition for that has to itself be a necessary reality. Now, just a kind of a technical note, the total of contingent realities, I think, has to be itself contingent because by the definition of contingent, if any part was removed, then you'd have a different totality. It wouldn't be the exact same totality. And so that particular totality wouldn't itself exist. It'd be a different one. But even if you think that the totality of contingent things is not contingent, well, then that leads us to the conclusion that there's something that's not contingent. So for sake of argument, assume the totality of contingent things is contingent. Assume that contingent things depend on prior causes or conditions. Then the cause or condition of the total of contingent things to avoid circularity can't itself be contingent. So in other words, it has necessary existence. So there's a necessary foundation that allows there to be contingent realities. So that's my second answer to your church friends, which is that we have an independent argument that even if you don't have uncontroversial examples of necessary things, we do have an independent argument that springs from reason and experience that gives us the conclusion that there's something special, something that is unlike the contingent things of our experience, something that transcends the contingent world and has a robust nature that exists of necessity.
Yeah, thank you. I guess it's by nature of case, there has to be something unique, and that's why it is a rare example because it is unique.
Yeah.
So there is nothing
Thank you.
unusual.
That's
Yeah.
a third response, which I like that improves upon what I just said there. I mean, we should expect it to be unique and special precisely because it's the kind of thing that is unlike the things that have a cause. It's the kind of thing that's foundational and uncaused. So it's going to be unique in that way. Good point.
Okay, so let's explore your third step. So we came to necessary and contingent existence, and can we know something about this necessary existence in?
Yeah, so the third step, you can think of this as now a solution to that puzzle. Why does anything exist? Well, something exists because, at least the first part of the answer, this won't answer every mystery, but it begins to solve it by explaining at least contingent things. So as I was just mentioning, contingent things have an explanation in terms of something more fundamental, that more fundamental thing that is not contingent. And that more fundamental thing has a necessary existence. So then you can have an answer, at least the beginning of an answer. Something exists rather than not. There's existence because there really could not have been just nothing. There has to be something. And the necessity of the existence of something provides a certain kind of explanation of why there's anything at all. Or or at least it provides a reason to think there's not going to have to be a deeper explanation. Because you can't have a deeper explanation of the total of reality. And if the foundation of reality has a necessary existence, then there's nothing sort of beyond that or prior to it that exists prior to the necessary thing, the necessary total that could explain it. So it's foundational. So that would be the third step is to see that there's got to be a necessary foundation to explain the contingent realities. And you can put that in terms of sort of there has to be a necessary foundation. But I also find it helpful when having conversations with people who are very curious about this argument and maybe they're a little bit resistant to the kind of overconfident dogmatic approach of like, you must believe this. And I find it helpful just to say, well, okay, I mean, other things being equal, would you agree that you can expect a further explanation unless you have some special reason to make an exception. So, like other things being equal, if you see a random object like a cup, you can expect there's probably going to be some further explanation of that object. That helps explain why there's not arbitrary objects randomly going in and out of existence all the time. There's an order to things, a causal order. And so that's kind of all you need really to get a reason or motivation to think that, okay, I mean, unless you have some independent reason to think that there can't be sort of a foundational reality, then you have the track record of explanations gives you an expectation that contingent things, other things being equal, are going to have a deeper explanation in terms of something fundamental, something not contingent. So that gives you kind of a softer argument, which takes us to the same conclusion. And it also opens it up to, well, are there sort of possible responses? This is why in the book I have a whole chapter called Testing Ground, and I look at possible responses to this third step because it's such an important step. It's the step that gets you to a foundational reality that exists on its own, of necessity, and provides the ultimate explanation of everything else.
Yeah, great. And do you personally, how certain about this conclusion do you?
My, I like this question because I've sort of surprised myself. I used to be less certain of it. I sort of thought of it as like maybe a reasonable hypothesis that explains a lot. But when I was in graduate school, I started to really think about like, well, what could be the difference between something that is caused by something else and then something that's uncaused? And as I really thought about like relevant differences, something happened in my mind where something just came into clarity. It was like, oh wait, if I if this cup depends on some cause, and then I show you another cup that is the same as this cup except it's just a little bit taller, I think it's possible to see with crystal clarity that merely increasing the size of the cup is not a relevant difference to explain why the one is caused and the other is uncaused. That size is an irrelevant difference there. And that you can actually extrapolate across the realm of contingent realities, that there's no difference in contingent realities that would explain the difference there. And that you would need an explanation of the difference to demarcate why is this thing cause and this thing not. And that reason just sort of made that clear to me. So that now, at the risk of being too bold, I guess I would say, yeah, I've become. I think that I would say that I would claim that, yeah, it seems very clear to me. I'm quite certain actually that contingent realities of any shape, size, or color are all in the same boat. They uniformly depend on prior causes, if any of them do. And so I'm convinced by experience that some do, and no difference between them is relevant. So yeah, so I would say I'm quite convinced at this point. You don't have to be convinced to find the conclusion evident, but yeah, I mean my cards on the table. I find it very very convincing.
Yeah. Yeah, I find this fascinating when we can start from every point in our life and just to go deeper and deeper and find some really insightful explanation about reality. And when I myself try to find some alternative explanation, I just can't find any, at least for me, that would be satisfactory on this level. And do you think that we can also find out that this necessary existent explanation is also some kind person or personal?
Yes, so some personal reality understood broadly, where maybe I prefer now that it has conscious capacity and unlimited power. And just because the term person is sort of flexible in its meanings, I don't mean a human person. I don't think that fundamental reality has, like a physical body or a white beard or a, um, a psychological profile that is sort of limited by the constraints of, a human personality. But I do think that it has the capacity of awareness. So it has that quality that you might think of as a mark of a person, to be aware. And not just aware, but also to intend and to have knowledge. Um, so how do I arrive at the sort of personhood or the consciousness of fundamental reality? Well, this is where I have a series of steps in the book, How Reasoning Can Lead to God. And then in my more recent book, Who Are You Really? You could think of that book as itself a kind of argument for the fundamental consciousness of reality or fundamental reality of God. Um, so there are actually different arguments that kind of go together here, but just very briefly, just to give you kind of a simple skeleton argument from the How Reason Can Lead to God, I'm trying to find an explanation of the rest of things that doesn't itself require a deeper, more fundamental explanation. So, I mean, this is where in graduate school, when I was really thinking, like, what could make the difference between the explained and the unexplained? And it seemed to me clear that differences in contingent realities couldn't make the difference. Okay. But remember, I said that positing a necessary foundation only begins to resolve the mystery because there's different theories of what that necessary reality is. So consider this. Now, here's a theory nobody holds, but it's an instructive theory. The turtle theory. Okay, this is the theory that fundamental reality is fundamentally the shape of a turtle. Now, you might think that that's sort of implausible or unlikely because turtle shapes have a further cause. But I would go further and say that actually, I think reason reveals that the turtle shape cannot be fundamental because that shape is not relevantly different from other shapes that are known to have a cause. That all shapes alike have to have some deeper cause or explanation. I mean, this, by the way, seems to be where the physicists are going, that the fundamental nature of our universe is not characterized even by a spatial reality. A space itself emerges, or at least the kind of sort of locations and shapes of space, the spatial properties emerge from a more fundamental reality. Well, I think reason supports that because I think that any kind of limited spatial reality will call for deeper explanation. So the fundamental reality, I think, has to be the kind of thing, to make sure this clear is so clear, that has to be relevantly different. Like what you said, it's got to be sort of unique in a way. It's got to be unique because it doesn't owe its existence to anything else. It's fundamental by definition. It's the anchor of everything else. So it can't depend on other things, and it can't have features or properties that themselves would require a deeper external outside explanation to make it have those properties. Now, maybe it could cause itself to have certain properties, okay? But it can't do it in a circular way. So it can't cause itself to have the ability to cause things. So it can't cause its own abilities because it has to already have ability, right? So ability is something more basic or foundational. And I would argue that any particular limit in its ability would itself call for further explanation. For example, if it has an ability to make 45 turtles, but not 46 turtles, that cutoff between 45 and 46 is a kind of arbitrary limit. Why does it have that ability rather than more or less? I think that would have to have a further cause. But since the foundational ability doesn't have any further cause, there's no ability prior to the foundational ability to be able to produce the foundational ability. The foundational ability has to, I think, be purely unlimited and unbounded. And through further analysis, I think this will include then the unbounded abilities of a mind. It would have the ability to make thoughts, to make um, contents of consciousness. And I think this makes sense if itself is fundamentally conscious. It has a field of consciousness that it flows from its essence, from what it is. Um, and so that would be one argument. And of course, I give other arguments that this foundational mind or consciousness hypothesis best explains how other beings like us could ever emerge, how we have consciousness that doesn't just come out of carbon atoms, but come out of a conscious reality. The kind of thing we are is rooted in a conscious foundation. Also, the fine tuning of the universe for life forms, the moral fabric of reality. There's a distinction between positive and negative states. That I think has a deeper explanation. And if you have a supreme foundation, a foundation that's filled out with a perfect or complete nature that doesn't have arbitrary limits and boundaries, then that will do two things for us. Our theory of fundamental reality, if it's filled in as a supreme nature, it'll do two things. First, it will remove the sort of arbitrary limits and boundaries that would call for further explanation. So it removes those things and allows it to be truly ultimate and foundational. And then second, this sort of supreme foundation, by being supreme, it then has the resources to explain all the different things that we see in the universe, the conscious beings, moral landscape, reasoning, mathematical landscape. And it allows us to do that in a way that I think is actually the sort of most elegant or simplest way. So we don't have arbitrary ad hoc parameters in our theory of fundamental reality. It's just purely perfect. And then that, again, allows us to explain a whole host of observations. So that would be kind of a summary of why I think that a sort of supreme. Now, here I'm condensing 4 or 5 other steps on the bridge into kind of one master summary. The summary is that if fundamental reality is supreme, then it's the kind of reality that could be fundamental. Then you have a more complete answer to why is there something rather than nothing. There's something rather than nothing because there could not have just been nothing. There could not have just been nothing because there's something that must be, has a firm grip on existence. There's something that must be because that thing doesn't have an arbitrary nature, an arbitrarily limited nature, but is filled out perfectly and completely. It's a maximal being, you could say. And then this is just what I mean by God. It's a maximal, fundamental reality from which everything else springs. And then that will include then the powers of a mind or of a person.
Wow. Wow, that's really fascinating.
Don't you just
I
love that? I mean, I just love how reason can sort of help us to think about these things. And I know this is a grand conclusion, and if people are listening to this have some doubts or questions, great. That's a beautiful thing. Doubts and questions are the instruments for more insight. I think it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think many people have very optimistic expectation about these arguments because it's really need to work out to uh, try to understand for many hours to grasp
Yes,
this idea because it's not like 5 minutes conversation and you okay, wow. Yeah.
agreed. Yeah. It takes some time to understand the concepts. And I mean, I think it's like that in life, the most beautiful buildings take more time to build than small, you know, clumsily put together buildings. And I think it's like that with pathways to insight. I think there are many pathways to insight. And I think that if you can have an insight that's supported by many different pathways, those many different pathways can help many people get that insight from different angles. And I think it's that way with the existence of God. I don't think there's just one pathway to come to believe in God. And I have a lot of respect for those who are on the journey and maybe have doubts, who have questions about the existence of God. I have a lot of respect for the journey. I think the journey, we learn so much on the journey, developing the intellectual virtues of courage to face reality. I think this is one of the valuable points about skepticism is that if it's such a great treasure of truth that this supreme being exists, you might sort of want that to be true. But if you can be willing to not believe that is true because you want the truth, in other words, you're willing to face reality and get to the truth, even if the truth isn't what you want it to be. And I think for me on my journey, I discovered that value of truth when I saw that it might be in conflict with what I want to believe. I mean, this is part of my story. It's like I noticed in myself a desire that the world be safe. And that I thought if God is really good and fundamental and loves us, and he's good in ways that are meaningful, it seems like that would make reality safer than if no God exists or if God is bad in some way. But then I realized I can't just make this up. I can't make up the nature of reality. It's like an ocean wave that's rolling away. I can't hold that wave in place. It's like it is what it is. And so that actually helped me to discover, oh, it takes courage to face reality. It takes courage to seek the truth if it might not be what you want it to be. And so I think that's where I started to really kind of feel in my heart a love for the truth seeker, the skeptic. I myself was a skeptic. I just wasn't sure what to think, and I think that that courage to face reality is important. I think it also takes courage to continue to seek to see, is there a treasure over here? I think that also takes courage, especially if you've been disappointed. This argument didn't work. This argument didn't work. You've been disappointed again and again. And so it takes courage to kind of keep that curiosity alive. Maybe the nature of the treasure is different than some people have said, and that creates sort of a barrier. Maybe the nature of the treasure, maybe the nature of God is grander or different than what we were thinking. And I think that if you sort of keep that courage alive to face reality and to seek treasure, that's where you're going to position yourself to find the most insight that's going to be relevant to you. This isn't just about the existence of God. I mean, this is about building out your worldview, about all the different topics that are meaningful to you. understanding how to manage resources, how to manage your relationships. All this comes from insight and insight into sort of fundamental principles about like how resources work, how do relationships work, how does reality work, how does reason work. And so this is where I get so passionate because I think people have powers to see more than they realize because they're waiting for others to kind of figure it out for them, or they're leaning on a group or a tribe to tell them the answers. But you have like within yourself the power of reason. You have the power of introspection to sort of be aware of your own questions. I mean, that is significant. Like questions are emerging in your mind. Imagine you see sand just floating in the sky. It's like, could questions emerge? Could a mind emerge out of the sand? The very fact that questions can emerge in your mind, you can be aware of that. You can think about that already is very, very special. It's a very special power. And I think we often sort of limit our powers because, like I said, we don't know how to use those powers. People didn't give us permission to sort of think for ourselves. I think sometimes this is just going back to my feeling of connection with the skeptics, the honest skeptics, the truth seekers, is that I think for a lot of them, the motivation is to see if we can get to the truth without being told that we have to believe this or we're going to get in trouble. Like this religion tells us you have to believe this or you're going to be in big, deep trouble. It's like, well, maybe we can actually test it for ourselves. This is why I always tell people on the bridge of reason, use your lights, test, try to break the bridge, make it your own, investigate it. Maybe there's another way of clarifying the concepts that's going to make more sense to you. Well, see that, find that out, follow the light because that's where you're going to be the most powerful in seeing the path to truth that's going to serve you the most.
Yeah, absolutely. And on another little bit topic, let's have some questions on ontological argument. It can be called the flip side of the coin of argument from contingency, as I understand. In this case, we just start from the foundation of being and try to see everything else. And do you consider any versions of this argument is valid?
So this is a tough question for me because I've been sort of in transition over the years. You might have seen some of my more recent work on ontological arguments. I do have some things on my blog on Substack where I describe some of my recent thinking. Um, I mean, okay, so basically the ontological argument is an argument purely from reason about the concept of God. So you just think about the concept of a supreme being, a maximally great being, and you're supposed to somehow, just from reasoning about that concept, deduce that that concept actually applies to reality. So you don't rely on any observations at all. Now, I want to just make sure it's very clear. My cosmological argument is not that argument because the cosmological argument starts with the observation that something exists and then draws from our experience with explanations and then uses reason and experience sort of together to arrive at a foundational theory of reality. But could you just think about the concept of a maximal being and derive the existence of that being just using logic or reason? And you might initially think, well, of course not. I mean, just because you have the concept of something doesn't mean it actually applies to reality. I mean, you have the concept of unicorns, but that doesn't apply to reality. And if you think that you can go from the concept to reality just using logic, then that must just be based on a trick. Don't fall for that trick. However, it's very interesting as you start thinking about the concept of God. It's a very special concept. It's not like the concept of a unicorn because the concept of God builds in some particular special properties, including the property of being perfect or supreme across all possible worlds. It's the kind of being that if it exists, it's so great that its existence and its greatness would span all possible realities. And some people have wondered if maybe you can go from this insight about the nature of God to the conclusion that God's very nature, if you even comprehend it, must span all the possible realities, including our reality. As long as that concept even possibly applies to any reality, it must apply to our reality. And there's a logic that allows us to make this very precise. I'm not going to do that here, but we could give some links to that, where you can deduce using our contemporary logic of possibility and necessity, making very minimal assumptions that if a supreme, maximally great being that would span all worlds, if it spans any, if that being were even possible to exist, then it would in fact actually exist. So then there's been this whole debate now among philosophers about whether the existence of God can be deduced to be even possible just using reason, right? Now, I mean, you could appeal to other arguments to try to argue that God's existence is possible. But some people have made the point that you could sort of reverse the argument. You could say, well, I mean, look, if God's existence is possible, then God's existence is necessary by this particular argument. But then symmetrically, if God's non-existence is possible, then that means that God's existence is not necessary, which means that God's existence is not even possible, given the inference from possibility to necessity. So then people say, well, then which is it? I mean, is it that God's existence is possible or that God's non-existence is possible? And you might think just thinking about those two possibilities, God exists or doesn't, reason sort of leaves that open, at least initially. And this is kind of where I was for many years until I saw some possible symmetry breaker, which breaks the symmetry between possibly God exists and possibly God doesn't. Do you want me to tell the story of the symmetry breaker that I was thinking about? I can be brief about it. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, go
Uh,
ahead.
maybe initially could you explain to our listeners why do you think that classical version of Anselm is not good enough to be sound?
So the Anselmian argument that you just go merely from the concept of a supreme being to the actual existence of a being, that argument has been developed in different forms, and either the argument, when you make it precise, seems to presuppose the conclusion. Um, so it's actually presupposing that the being than which none greater can be conceived can be referred to as an actual being. Or it seems like it's not really a valid argument because you're actually talking about the concept or the nature of the being, and you're saying that that thing is the greatest that can be conceived. But then that won't give you the existence of God. That will just give you some information about the concept, if the concept applies to reality. Um, Now, I mean, there are some people who say, well, maybe we can continue to develop the argument and turn it into a good argument. I'm skeptical of that. I mean, I guess the way to make progress would be to translate the argument into an argument that then leads to the symmetry problem, that the possibility of God's existence, the possibility of God's non-existence seems sort of symmetrical. So you need some independent way of breaking the symmetry to see that God possibly exists versus God possibly doesn't. I mean, and then that's where I have this sort of more recent thinking about what are called Gödelian ontological arguments. These are ontological arguments that are inspired by Kurt Gödel, the mathematician, who came up with a certain way of thinking about positive attributes or positive properties. I independently actually just woke up one morning with this thought. I just woke up and I had this thought that like positive properties don't entail negative properties. And I didn't know what to make of it. I just like had that thought, but I was like thinking about, seems like that's going to have implications for the ontological argument. So as I thought about it, I realized, oh, actually it does because if positive properties don't entail negative properties, so positive like value implying properties or greatness implying properties like love or power or goodness don't imply of necessity negative properties like departures from love or ignorance or something. So you can have these positive properties, at least if they're atomic positive properties are not decomposable into other complex properties that mix the positive and the negative. They're purely positive properties. They won't entail the negative. And then you can actually build an argument from there to the possibility of a perfect being, because if the being were imperfect, then you can deduce that it would have some positive properties that entail negative properties. And I don't want to spell out the deduction here, but you can show that if it is a necessary reality, and then it's the kind of reality that couldn't exist if it doesn't exist, then you can show that if it doesn't exist, then it couldn't exist, and that its positive properties would actually end up entailing negative properties for technical reasons. Um, and so if positive properties don't entail the negative, then you can show that then it must possibly exist, therefore actually exists. And I have some thoughts about that where I think it's sort of open-ended in my mind whether that kind of argument can be developed. I think it's an important, interesting argument to explore. It's different than the cosmological argument, but I haven't ruled it out. It seems like you could motivate even just by experience, that positive properties don't entail negative properties, and then you can use that as a premise. Um, Although if you motivate it by experience, now it's no longer an purely ontological argument. So, um, I mean, it's like, can you just see by reason, that it's the nature of a positive property they can't entail a negative property? Maybe you can. That's where I'm still kind of on the edge of my thinking. Not so sure. Might work, might not.
Yeah, it's not easy argument. So for listeners, you could explore more in books on the link
Yeah.
uh, in the description. Personally, I like this Plantinga style argument because it's very simple for me. I know that recently Joshua Sijawade published new book, but I just can't understand this argument, so I don't know anything. I can say anything about this, but perhaps there is some new insights about ontological argument.
And if I may just add, the Plantingian argument. Plantinga was my dissertation. Well, he was my research advisor at Notre Dame, and I actually have an article where I talk about Plantinga's ontological argument, and I raise a sort of symmetry problem. Like, well, what about the reverse ontological argument? And that's where I think um, if there's a way of sort of breaking the symmetry, I offer even another possible way of breaking the symmetry in favor of the possibility of God's existence. And so I think there's definitely area there to explore, and that would then be a way of supporting the Plantingian cosmological argument. I mean, sorry, the Plantingian ontological argument, using kind of more sophisticated reasoning.
Yeah, but I think it is possible, yeah, for somebody like Plantinga just say to, well, I just think that God's existence is possible, just obvious to me, and I have no reason to doubt this. Is it possible move from some philosopher to
You
do
could
this?
you could say that the question is whether the possibility of theism is more evident to your own mind than the possibility of atheism. I mean, and even Plantinga, in his more recent thinking, I think has sort of recognized this symmetrical problem more than he did when he first published his paper. I mean, I remember in class he would say, "You have to be very careful." It's like he's speaking from wisdom of experience. Like, be very careful not to confuse seeing that something's possible, really seeing that's possible, versus failing to see that it's impossible. Maybe you fail to see that God's existence is impossible, but maybe you also fail to see that God's non-existence is impossible. And so that could just lead you into a state of agnosticism. You don't really have insight into the possibility of God's existence, just as you don't have insight into the possibility of God's non-existence. You don't have direct insight. Um, and now maybe you do. I mean, I want to kind of be open to that. I mean, in principle, somebody could just say, well, when I think about possibly God exists and possibly God doesn't exist, it just strikes me that it's more likely possible that God exists than possible that God doesn't. The possibility of God's existence sort of seems more intuitive. But why is it more intuitive? And then that's where you have these kind of more advanced arguments that might support that possibility premise through a longer chain of reasons.
Yeah, sure. I also hear sometimes that ontological arguments somehow presuppose Meinongian ontology, this weird idea. I don't understand exactly, I don't understand why it's presupposed because I don't see why even Anselm should presuppose this in his argument. Maybe you could explain.
The Meinongian idea that you can have realities that aren't actual, so that you can actually talk about like unicorns are real in some sense, but they're not like actually real in our reality, but they exist. And so some philosophers, so I mentioned that there's been a project to sort of understand Anselm's argument in a rigorous way, so we can see that it's both valid and its premises are true, and the conclusion follows. Um, some philosophers have worked it out so that you avoid some of the technical problems by assuming Meinongianism. And so then some people then have responded to that, saying, well, that's a cost of that way of defending the argument. Um, but I agree with you that is in general for an ontological argument, certainly not for Plantinga's ontological argument. But maybe you sort of need something like that to rescue the original Anselmian argument.
Hmm, interesting. Okay, last question. What books or materials could you recommend to explore these questions more? Obviously, it's your book and your series of books, but maybe you do have some favorite authors or something like this that you could recommend.
It's a great question. There's a shorter book that I have, The Bridge of Reason, 10 Steps to See God. Some people might be interested in that. But I think really a book in epistemology to get sort of a tool set for thinking about these things. Um, I don't really have a specific one that comes to mind, but any good book in epistemology, there are good epistemologists like Richard Fumerton. I mean, Alvin Plantinga is an excellent epistemologist. Um, if you sort of just research the top epistemologists, find one of their entry level books, I would highly recommend that. I think epistemology is very, very important. And one of my next books that I want to work on outside of consciousness, another book on the mind, is a truth seeker's sort of guidebook to give you the tools for seeking the truth. And so that's something that's sort of in the works, but I can't recommend it now. But at some point, I'll love to point to it because I think we need to have the resources to do the worldview development. And even a lot of epistemology books, they can get kind of sort of academic and technical in these debates over different epistemological systems, internalism, externalism, empiricism, rationalism. And those debates sometimes skate over some very important things that I would say we know, like we actually have a kind of consensus. And also there are intellectual virtues that we can develop that really make a huge difference. And combining the virtues with the tools can make you very, very powerful in your quest for truth. So I'm still working on that. Sorry, I can't recommend my own book on that, but any good book in epistemology, I think, will be very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe could you give some hope for our listeners who is really upset that this book is so hard and technical? Uh, how many years do you have to study so to understand some of these questions? Maybe there is more to our listeners to hope.
ChatGPT can help simplify. I think, it's interesting because when I started my journey into philosophy, there's a sense in which immediately you can get insights. Like as soon as you start seeking insights, you get insights. It's like making money. It's like as soon as you set your intention, I'm going to get more income, you can start to get more income. It might be sort of slow going, but over time you just get better at it. Same thing with getting insight. It's you just start by seeking insight. That's the most fundamental power that you have is to intend to aim to get more insight. You aim to get insight, then you pick up these books. I try to write How Reason to Lead to God. I write it so that it can be accessible, that you don't have to have any training in philosophy to follow that book. And then I mentioned The Bridge of Reason, 10 Steps to See God, because that's even more accessible in the sense it's shorter. I mean, both books, I define my terms, but so you can always just get started with an accessible book and then build from there.
Absolutely. So this is so great conversation, and I have many questions, and maybe in future we could continue to our discussion. Thank you so much for your time, for your work. I really appreciate, and I have a lot of knowledge because of you. So God bless you, and hope to see you in the future.
Mikhail, thank you. It's been such a pleasure hanging out with you. Thank you for your grace with your time. Really, it's just an honor to have this conversation with you, and I hope it does encourage your audience. Especially to feel like you can search the truth by your own lights. You have the power to do that. You don't have to lean on somebody else to give you the packages. You can trust others for guidance, but you can discover the powers that you have within as well. So, thank you for the time to be with you.
Yeah, I think it's most important message from today's show. So guys, let's explore truth.